If the truth is sacred, why are we afraid to look for it? Here's the uncomfortable claim. The Jesus you were taught about, the miracle worker, the Son of God, the Savior of the world, leaves no independent historical footprint. Not one Roman record, not one eyewitness letter, not one neutral account that places him in the time he supposedly walked the earth. And this isn't coming from skeptics alone. Crack open the very sources defenders lean on, and you see the cracks immediately. The Gospels? Anonymous, written decades after the events they claim to describe. Paul? He never quotes Jesus, never describes a moment in his company. Instead, he talks about visions, dreams, voices. That's not biography. That's revelation. So here's the question. If a man truly shook an empire, where is the empire's paperwork? Think about it. Rome documented minor tax disputes. They kept records of trivial trials and petty criminals. But for the most famous crucifixion in history, silence. Pause here. If you want the actual sources, the graphics, the receipts, make sure you hit subscribe now. Because what comes next are the contradictions you've never been shown. The ones hidden in plain sight. And this is where the avalanche begins. Truth doesn't need protection. Myths do. Rome documented tax receipts. Where is Jesus? Before we go any further, we need ground rules. History is not faith. Faith can survive without evidence, but history demands contemporaneous, independent corroboration. That's the line. Belief and history are not the same thing. And here's the burden. Extraordinary public claims. Demand ordinary public records. A trial, a crucifixion, miracles in front of crowds. Those should leave a paper trail. So let's set up a scorecard. 4 columns. First, Roman documentation. Second, Jewish chroniclers. Third, early Christian texts. And finally, archaeology. This is the filter. And it's the exact same one historians use for peasants, soldiers, and forgotten scribes. No special pleading, no lowered bar. Because if we can verify nobodies through scraps of receipts and graffiti, surely the Son of God should pass the same test. Watch what happens when we run the Jesus story through this filter. When we ask history, not faith, to answer. Belief answers why. History answers what happened. And with that, our checklist is ready. Column 1. Rome, the paper-obsessed superpower. Crucifixion wasn't just brutal. It was bureaucratic. Rome ran on paperwork. Trials had charges. Sentences had records. Placards were posted above the condemned. Public executions were logged, because that's how an empire kept order. And yet, for the most famous crucifixion in history, silence. Think about it. Rome noted tax receipts. They documented grain shipments. They even preserved complaints scratched as graffiti on city walls. But not a single contemporary Roman line on Jesus. Not one. Now drill down further. The Gospels describe darkness falling over the land, earthquakes splitting the ground, dead rising from their graves. Do you realize what that would mean? We're talking about citywide chaos. An empire obsessed with order would have written volumes on such events. But there are no civic entries, not a word. Here's the mini reveal. We have more surviving evidence for Roman plumbing in Judea than for this supposed world-shaking execution. Where's the paperwork? Where are the records? Where is Rome's voice in this story? Empires don't forget spectacles. But here, the silence is absolute. Maybe, just maybe, Jewish historians noticed what Rome didn't, right? Whenever this subject comes up, defenders always reach for the same two names, Josephus and Tacitus. Let's start with Josephus, a Jewish historian writing in the 1st century. Yes, there's a passage where he supposedly mentions Jesus, but read it closely. It doesn't sound like a historian at all. It sounds like a believer. He was the Christ. On the 3rd day, he rose again. That's not neutral description. That's a confession of faith. And scholars, Christian and secular alike, have admitted those lines were tampered with. Later redactions, interpolations, words inserted long after Josephus was gone. The fingerprints are obvious. Now, Tacitus, a Roman historian writing about Nero, around 116 CE. He does mention Christus, but notice the gap. 80 to 90 years after the alleged events. No access to eyewitnesses. No sign he was digging through state archives. Most likely, he was repeating what Christians themselves were already saying. So yes, Josephus and Tacitus mention a figure. But mentions are not contemporaneous evidence. They're echoes. And a late echo isn't a footprint. And here's the mini hook. If these two passages are the strongest citations defenders can muster, prepare yourself, because the biggest contradiction is still ahead. It comes from the earliest Christian voice. Paul met a Jesus, just not in the way you think. Here's something most people don't realize. The earliest Christian writings are not the Gospels. They're the letters of Paul. And when you open them, something is missing. There's no earthly itinerary, no stories of traveling with Jesus, no dinner conversations, no parables quoted from memory. Instead, Paul talks about visions, revelations, encounters in dreams and in spirit. That's the earliest Jesus we can document. Not a public teacher walking dusty roads, but a revealed figure, appearing in mystical experience. Now stop and think. If someone told you they met a man in a vision, would you log that as a census entry? Would you call it history? Here's the cognitive flip. Our earliest Christian witness does not describe a man at all. He describes a revelation. And that raises the question, if Jesus was a household name shaking the empire, why does the earliest voice sound like a mystic, not a biographer? Visions don't need maps. So if Paul didn't write a biography, who did? And in what language? Now we arrive at the Gospels, the supposed biographies of Jesus. Here's the first shock. They were anonymous. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, added later. The writers never identify themselves. Second shock. They were written decades after the events they describe. Not in Aramaic, the language Jesus and his followers supposedly spoke, but in Greek, by educated outsiders writing from other regions. If these were eyewitnesses, why would they write in a foreign tongue, decades later, and never sign their own names? And then come the contradictions. Matthew and Luke disagree on the genealogy. They can't even agree on the family tree. One gospel says Jesus was born in a stable. Another never mentions it. One has shepherds at the manger. Another has wise men following a star. Even the final words on the cross, the climactic moment of the story, don't match. Each gospel gives him different last lines. So here's the aha moment. If four biographies of the most important life in history can't agree on basic frames, what genre are we actually reading? Anonymous stories don't become eyewitnesses just because you add names later. Maybe, just maybe, it's because the story itself was following a familiar script. one older than Christianity. Step back for a moment and look at the pattern. Born of a virgin, a star in the sky to mark the birth, a childhood marked by wisdom beyond years, miracles, healing the sick, feeding crowds, even raising the dead, a betrayal, a violent death, and finally, a glorious return. Does that sound familiar? It should, because this template shows up long before Christianity. Horus, Mithras, Dionysus. Different cultures, different names, but the same script. And here's the key line. The Jesus story doesn't just fit the mold, it clicks into it. When the same motifs repeat across myth after myth, it stops looking like biography and starts looking like mythology, rebranded for a new audience. A new costume doesn't make a new character. So here's a challenge for you. Comment below with which of these motifs you've seen in other traditions. We'll pin the best examples. But stories on paper are one thing. What about the ground? The literal ground. Archaeology is history's handwriting, stones, strata, settlements. They leave traces, layers of pottery, inscriptions, commercial records, the debris of everyday life. And that's why the silence here is so striking. Take Nazareth, the town where Jesus was supposedly raised. Archaeologists have long debated whether it even existed in the first century. The evidence is thin, late, and contested. Or Bethlehem, the birthplace chosen to fulfill prophecy, a narrative that seems driven more by theology than by verifiable geography. Here's the problem. When you dig into the soil, you expect consistency, layers of daily life that align with the stories. Instead, you find debates, disputes, gaps where anchors should be. We have addresses for nobodies, merchants, soldiers, farmers whose names survive on receipts and gravestones. But for the man said to change the course of history, the trail is patchy at best. Archaeology is history's handwriting, and here the page is smudged. If the ground is quiet, then the texts must be louder. Are they? Now we reach the heart of the story, the resurrection, the event that's supposed to prove everything. But look closer. The accounts don't agree. In one gospel, the tomb is guarded. In another, there is no guard at all. In one version, a single woman discovers the empty tomb. In others, it's several women. Different names, different numbers. Some say Jesus appears in Galilee. Others place the appearance in Jerusalem. Some accounts describe him speaking to crowds. Others, only to a few. These aren't small details. They are fundamental contradictions. And both can't be true. Now here's the logic check. An event that overturns the laws of nature. A man rising from the dead. Shouldn't that attract outside attention? Roman officials, temple records, neutral witnesses. Yet every account we have comes from inside the movement, written decades later, by authors who can't even agree on who saw what, or where, or when. And here's the aha moment. If the climax of the story can't align, why should we trust the earlier chapters? When the endings disagree, the story changes. And maybe that's the point. Maybe this was never about evidence at all. Maybe it was about power. Christianity didn't spread because evidence piled up. It spread because politics demanded it. Once Rome adopted the faith, belief became law. Questioning it became dangerous. Dissent was branded heresy. And texts were filtered, standardized, and enforced. Think about the councils. Centuries after Jesus supposedly lived, bishops gathered to decide which books counted and which would be buried, burned, or banned. That's not history unfolding naturally. That's an editorial meeting. Doctrines like the Trinity weren't discovered through evidence. They were declared by vote. And the version of Jesus you know today, the divine Savior, the eternal Son, wasn't carved in stone by eyewitnesses. It was constructed in councils. Here's the hook. History doesn't need an editor. Orthodoxy does. And once orthodoxy had the power of empire behind it, its version of Jesus became untouchable. Not because it was truer, but because it was useful. Doctrines passed. That's politics, not proof. And if politics decided the text, what about the so-called evidence you can touch? The relics? Now, let's talk about relics. The so-called touchable proof. Shrouds, crowns of thorns, splinters of the true cross. They didn't appear in the first century. They appeared centuries later, right when pilgrimage and profit went hand in hand. By the Middle Ages, there were enough fragments of the true cross to build an entire forest. More wood than there were trees in Galilee. And provenance? It collapses instantly. Every time a relic is tested, it turns out to be medieval at best, not first century. These artifacts track piety and money, not verifiable history. Souvenirs aren't sources. And here's the cliffhanger. If even the touchables crumble under scrutiny, we're left with a question most people are scared to ask. Here's the most common pushback. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And sometimes that's true, but only when you wouldn't expect evidence in the first place. Here, the opposite is the case. Jesus is said to have drawn crowds, challenged rulers, worked public miracles, and endured a trial and execution under Rome itself. That should leave marks. Absence becomes evidence when presence is expected. Think about it. Ordinary ancients, merchants, soldiers, even local farmers left receipts, graffiti, inscriptions, letters. We can trace the lives of nobodies through scraps of pottery and tax rolls. But for the central figure of one of the world's largest religions, not a single verified contemporaneous trail. Silence is not neutral when the volume should be deafening. That's the expected evidence test. If nobodies leave records, but a supposed world shaker leaves nothing, the silence itself becomes evidence. When absence breaks the pattern, absence speaks. So then the real question becomes, if not evidence, what kept this story alive? Let's pause here, because for some of you, this isn't just information, it's identity. And I want you to hear this clearly. Doubt is not betrayal. It's fidelity to truth. Your worth, your value, your humanity do not hinge on inherited stories. You weren't misled. You were trained to trust. Now, you're training yourself to verify. That shift is not a loss. It's growth. Curiosity is not a sin. It's a compass. And once you see that, once you allow yourself permission to question without fear, everything changes. So the question becomes, if the old story doesn't hold, what do we build together from here? If you value receipts over reverence, you found your people. This channel isn't about tearing down for the sake of it. It's about asking the questions generations were trained to overlook and retraining ourselves to investigate together. Because belief can comfort, but evidence can free. And this is only the beginning. Next, we'll dive into how the canon was formed, what the earliest Christian art really showed, and what archaeology continues to reveal. So here's your invitation. Subscribe now. Drop a comment with the meme, the myth, or the claim you want investigated next. And if someone tells you, just have faith, share this with them and ask them to bring evidence. We investigate, not indoctrinate. And in the next episode, we'll test the strongest counterarguments on their own terms.